back to cities where the other half world lives. I'm reporting on behalf of a number of community members in Chicago who happen to live near Lake Michigan. And it was on Lake Michigan, this great blue inland sea, when on July 27th, 1919, a young African-American boy named Eugene Williams, swimming in the water just a little bit offshore, went a little too far into a whites-only area. And somebody threw a stone at him, and he struggled for a while, and then he drowned. And he became one of 38 people who died in the race riot of 1919 in Chicago, triggered by an event at a Chicago beach. Not far from that Chicago beach and that Bronzeville community that Eugene Williams was from is the neighborhood of Chinatown, which in the 19-teens was also coming into shape through legal mechanisms and violence-based mechanisms to hold communities in place and away from resources like Lake Michigan. Just west of Chinatown is another neighborhood in Chicago called Pilsen, which in the 1950s and beyond, in the 60s and 70s, became one of the main Latino ports of entry into the city. Predominantly working class neighborhood with the lowest green space per capita of any of Chicago's 77 community areas. So it's something of a wall that has existed between communities very close that neighbor Lake Michigan and Lake Michigan itself. And so what I'm going to describe here is a process by which folks in those communities have worked to build bridges to the lake, and are also somewhat suspicious of master narratives of biodiversity and of open space, and how they would like to see their own narratives entered into the story. Speaking from the vantage point of the Field Museum, I know about master narratives. And Chicago, the Field Museum grew out of the 1893 World's Fair that was designed by Daniel Burnham, who went on in 1909 to design the great plan for the Chicago region. Burnham intended that the lake should be a resource for all people in the city. And as the city went about doing this, and they put the Field Museum right there on the lake. This is a 1929 aerial view. They made land on the south lakefront, and that's the Bronzeville neighborhood to the right there, that was separated from the lake by railroad tracks and by Lakeshore Drive and by, as it turned out to be, a very desultory maintenance regime by the Chicago Park District, a pattern of neglect on the south side that went into the 1980s and 90s when a court order finally made them pay attention. Meanwhile, the Field Museum itself has a position on the lakefront. There's a glass-fronted convention hall there, McCormick Place, that kills birds every day for the past 35 years. Museum staff have collected the birds from the base of that convention hall and have persuaded the Park District that it's to their advantage to add native landscaping and to think about biodiversity on the south lakefront, remove the turf grass and remove the weed trees that have grown and diversify the landscape. Park District took that to heart and established, and this is the idea of a Burnham, and Daniel Burnham's name again, wildlife corridor that would run from the museum at about 12th Street for about 3.5 miles down to Hyde Park. And there you see the communities outlined: Pilsen, Chinatown, and Bronzeville. So how would a wall become a bridge? And the Park District began to vigorously move through its process of tearing up the turf grass and planting natives and so forth, but they were not resonating with that message at all in the communities nearby. Communities that for years had regarded much of what the Park District did with suspicion. So they came to us. We had some connections through projects that we had run in these neighborhoods, thinking of a climate change adaptation project that we did and had built up a number of community linkages. And the first step was to think about the bridge as one foundation for the bridge should be to think about the next generation. So we established a group few years ago called Green Ambassadors. Every summer, 12 high school kids would be involved in learning the ecosystems of this gradually diversifying, ecologically diversifying lakefront, but also carry that message back to the communities and connect it back into their work in the neighborhood. They learned techniques of participant action research, did some citizen science, and also became docents on projects like this one, which is another kind of a foundation to involve people themselves in, and this reminds me a lot of the Bogota example, of literally being part of the restoration activity, not just removing invasives, but in this case, on Mother's Day in 2014, 30 different community organizations were connected to bring 900 people to plant 25,000 trees. It happened to be Mother's Day weekend. It was a great intergenerational activity. It was fantastic to see kids get their fingernails dirty, and my museum president get his fingernails dirty as well. It also was important to see Green Ambassadors take leadership in this moment, these teens, guiding groups of people out to the planting sites, helping them with that. And then later, in reflecting on the experience, saying every time they drove down Lakeshore Drive, they would say, well, we planted that. That's part of the landscape that we had a hand in helping to become. In 2015, this turned into a butterfly meadow planting across 2.5 acres, a lot of milkweed and other native plants. And there's kind of two foundations of a bridge. But there needs to be something like a span. That master narrative is still in place. This is biodiversity. It's good for you. You should like it. This was not necessarily a resonant message in communities along the South Chicago lakefront. And so working again with community organizations, we developed what we called a co-curation committee to put into place 5 different public art installations in the 2.5 miles along the South Lakefront. The co-curation committee consisted of members from local community organizations, local artists. They devised a request for proposals. They reviewed the proposals and they oversaw the installations. The Park District of Chicago was persuaded to divert $100,000 that had planned for benches. They were going to be the recycled plastic benches that they use, to be $20,000 each for each of these 5 projects. So I'd like to walk you through these a little bit. These are some of the co-curation committee. In each of these projects, the project design required integrate some element of nature, integrate some element of community cultural heritage, and have a community artist partnering with a community organization to devise the space. So from the north, caracol, a snail form. This is Diana Solis and Jose Terrazas, who made this snail-like form for an organization called Contratiempo, which does literacy-based work. The place is filled with words on that path written by members of the community on their reflections on the natural space. Philosopher's Stone, Scholar's Stone, a spirit stone, the Chinese American community organization, following a pattern frequently seen in contemplative spaces in Chinese gardens. This one is La Ronda Parataca. This was created by Casa Michoacan and was a comment on the monarch butterfly. Edgar Duarte and Piloto Nieves were the artists. They fabricated monarch-shaped forms and surrounded the space with milkweed on a spot just a couple hundred yards from where Eugene Williams drowned. Sounding Bronzeville was made of willow and was meant to be an auditory experience as the wind whistled through the willow forms and a connection to the sounds of Bronzeville. This is the Bronzeville Community Development Partnership that created this space, and we're thinking here about Louis Armstrong, everybody from Louis Armstrong to Chance the Rapper, folks from the neighborhood. Sankofa for the Earth uses the Sankofa bird. Go back and fetch it is the West African proverb, meaning you go back for your heritage to move forward in the space. This space was a mosaic. It also had images of people from the neighborhood, Emmett Till, Gwendolyn Brooks, people who, as you were in the space, a few steps from the Illinois Central Railroad tracks that were such a major migration path for African Americans to the north, was part of the experience, would be part of the experience of the space. So these places were connected to each other by a wood chip path. I'm thinking about the comment from yesterday about 45 minutes in nature and the role that it can play in a community. The Park District itself has finally built an actual bridge and established a plaque in the location that commemorates this as part of a Great Migration Trail along the South Lakefront. All of this in the context of a much richer biological space as well. The 100 acres was going to be expanded to 125 acres. So at the end of the day, what do we have? A richer space biologically, a richer space culturally where people are participating in the creation of the narrative about it. Large institutions working with small institutions, communities working across traditional lines. And I would say the Park District has found this as very useful as a pilot that they intend to deploy in other natural areas across the city now. And folks are feeling that they've found a bit of resilience in a rough part of the world where they've broken down a few of the walls that divide them from each other and from nature and have stayed the hands of that we're going to throw the stones that sink us. So thanks very much.